join hands virtually, and that way we can begin the seance. And help me to call for James McNeill Whistler. Are you there, Mr. Whistler? We're calling your spirit to appear before us.
I hear you. I hear you. What?
It worked.
Oh, let me move towards the light. There. And who do I have the honor of addressing tonight?
Oh, Mr. Whistler, I'm Joan Harper, and we have many of your fans and devoted patrons here on the call with us. And I'm so excited that we've been able to do this again, that I think we should just begin with the festivities while we have a strong mystical connection with you.
Excellent. Is this the Whistler Society again? I remember you.
Yes, both.
I remember speaking to you once. I think you had a far less attractive medium at that time, but I'm glad to see the improvement.
Oh, well, I'll take that as a compliment, as I'm sure it was intended. I would like to begin with our first question, but I fear that Professor Margaret MacDonald has not managed to get herself onto our seance. Can we wait a little bit and go with the next question, Mr. Whistler?
All right.
All right, that would be from Sarah Bogosian, who is the president and executive director of the Whistler House Museum of Art, located in the home of your birth, Lowell, Massachusetts. Sarah, Sarah, could I ask you to unmute and ask your question?
Of course. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, it's so wonderful to be here. I'm thrilled to be with everyone tonight. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Mr. Whistler, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you and ask a question. And here it is. Which subject matter in your work gives you the most pleasure to create? Is there one work in this genre which you prefer the most, are proudest of?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Let me think. You know, I think I derive the most pleasure from depicting nature as I saw it. I achieved this in many ways during my long and illustrious career, both painting and drawing. I did landscapes, seascapes, views of London, Paris, Venice, Amsterdam, and I must stress, as I saw nature. I explained this all superbly in my 10 o'clock lecture, which I'm sure all of you have read. It is still in print, you know, and considered, I'm told, the finest thing ever penned by an artist, a transcendent piece of literature. Nature, I said, contains the elements in color and form of all pictures, as the keyboard contains the notes of all music. But the artist is born to pick and choose and group with science these elements, that the result may be beautiful. And further, I proclaim, seldom does nature succeed in producing a picture. My Nocturnes are the purest form of this philosophy. They're all magnificent, each in its own way. But I think my favorite must be Nocturne Blue and Silver Chelsea, because my dear mother helped me paint it. It was the summer of 1871. I was still working on her portrait, but one day, when she felt too feeble to sit for me, we spent an enjoyable afternoon on the Thames, and riding through town, we returned to Cheyne Walk just before sunset, and I was so taken by the glow on the river that I simply had to capture it. Mother helped by bringing me tubes of paint as I required them, and, of course, praising my work as it progressed.
Thank you, Mr. Whistler. That was really interesting. We have the next question from Dan Sutherland. Dan is Professor Emeritus now of History at the University of Arkansas and author of Whistler, A Life for Art's Sake, which I'm sure you have read.
Of course, I know Dan.
Dan, can I ask you to unmute and ask your question? There he is.
There. Excellent. Mr. Whistler, what a joy to see you.
And you, sir, and you.
You seem to have more white hair than your portraits reveal, but you look as vibrant and youthful as ever.
Thank you for saying so.
But speaking of youth, I've read that you started drawing at the age of 2, but I wonder when it was that you decided that you wanted to become an artist.
Oh, let me tell you about that. So it's an interesting story, if I do say so myself. What happened was that when I was very young, I displayed my genius. And you may have seen this picture, this marvelous picture, I may say, of a duck I drew when I was just 4 years old. But actually, my fondest desire as a boy was to be a soldier. Of course, generations of my ancestors had been soldiers, not least my famous father. But I also remember the thrill I experienced in watching the Tsar's magnificent military reviews when we lived in St. Petersburg. I believe that even my dear mother was impressed by those brilliant displays. But that all changed when I was 14 and living with my sister Deborah and her family in London. I'd already taken drawing lessons at the Imperial Academy of Art in St. Petersburg and seen several magnificent exhibitions in that city. But Deborah's husband, Seymour Hayden, whom I then regarded as a friend, introduced me to the art world of London. And my father, who appreciated my talent, suggested that a paying career as an architect or engineer might suit me. But he too stoked my desire to be an artist by giving me a Christmas gift in 1848 of Sir Joshua Reynolds's magisterial Discourses on Art. And that gave me the courage to write these words as I recall them in response to my father. I wrote, "I hope, dear father, you will not object to my choice of a profession as a painter, for I wish to be one so very much, and I don't see why I should not. Many others have done so before. I hope you will say yes in your next, and that dear mother will not object to it." Well, 2 months later, my father died, and that altered my life completely. And when I entered West Point 2 years later, it looked as though I would follow a soldier's career after all. Luckily, I was asked to leave the academy, most politely, by our superintendent, none other than Robert E. Lee. Perhaps you've heard of him. A year after that, I came of age. I left America for Paris, and I embraced the life for which I had been destined.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Whistler. Our next question comes from Susie Hyde, a longtime member of the Society. She's asking a question on behalf of Martin Riley. Susie, can I ask you to unmute?
Yes, I think I have done. So, Mr. Whistler, Martin's question is about your contemporaries. He wants to know from which of the artists you worked alongside you feel that you took most inspiration and insight.
That's an interesting question. Despite my reputation for dismissing the work of my contemporaries, I did learn a few things from a few of them. There was, of course, Courbet in the beginning, although I came to regret the way in which I was seduced by his reliance on color. And that is why I began to limit the range of my palette and concentrate more on draftsmanship in the late 1860s. Then there were Le Gros and Fontaine-Latour, We presented ourselves to the world as the Société de Trois and pledged to die for art. It did not last long. We did borrow ideas from one another, but Legros later betrayed my trust, and Fontaine simply failed to appreciate or even understand the evolution of my painting. I found the work of some of the old pre-Raphaelites useful, especially Gabriel Rossetti, whose influence you may see in a painting like The White Girl or my etching of Joe called Weary. Manet's work constantly challenged me to go further, to attempt more daring ideas and solutions. Later came Monet, although I dare say he learned more from me than I from him. Perhaps I was most impressed by Degas. He tried to persuade me to join him in the so-called independents, later for some bizarre reason dubbed the Impressionists, in their first exhibition, but I was miles ahead of those Johnnies and did not want to be tied to any specific movement. My art was Whistlerian, unique, and I refused to have it diminished through association with second-rate talents. And really, though, none of those people taught me as much as Rembrandt or Hokusai, or Velasquez or Hogarth, especially Hogarth.
Fantastic, thank you. Our next question comes from Bob Roach. He is on the board of the Whistler House Museum and has a Christmas question. Bob, can you unmute?
Yes, thank you, Joan. It's so nice to be here. I've sat through so many seances as a child with my parents, so this is a nice remember when. And behind me are many books, and there are several of the books on Mr. Whistler. So it's lovely to be here. And Mr. Whistler, my question is about Christmas and winter. They don't seem to appear often in your work. As a man who enjoyed festivities, I'm surprised that no family gathering, feast, or parties appear in your etchings or paintings. Can you tell me why this is, please?
Well, I can, but I must say that you must really inspect my work more closely. One of my earliest paintings was The Thames in Ice. I completed it in 3 days at Christmas time in 1860, bleak and miserably damp winter, as I recall. Worked from inside an inn in Rotherhithe. Seymour Hayden, we mentioned him earlier, bought it for £10. And do not forget, Chelsea and Ice, done 4 years later, on my Nocturne of Trafalgar Square in snow, or Nocturne, gray and gold Chelsea snow, done in the late 1870s. Yes, plenty of winter. I also recall trying to do some etching during my retreat to Venice in 1879, but it was the coldest winter there in 30 years. I could not hold a needle properly in my freezing fingers, icicles hanging from the brim of my hat. As for family gathering, well, really, I mean, do you take me for a Tissot? Pleasant fellow though he may be, am I to be a Dickens of the palate? Surely everyone here knows my aversion to narrative in my work. Take the Nocturne I just mentioned, Chelsea Snow. I explained to a journalist at the time in my famous red rag that if I had wanted to tell a story, I would have called the painting, speaking of Dickens, Trotty Vic. No, it's simply a snow scene with a single black figure and a lighted tavern. I care nothing for the past, present, or future of the black figure, which I placed there only because the black was wanted at that spot. All I know is that my combination of gray and gold is the basis of the picture. I should hold it vulgar and meretricious trick to excite people about Trotty Vic, when if they really could care for pictorial art at all, they would know that the picture should have its own merit and not depend on dramatic or legendary or local interest.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to Mr. Whistler. Again, next we have a question from our own Patrick Duffy. He's a Whistler Society committee member and is also responsible for the brilliant newsletters that you each receive each quarter. In his day job, he is Associate Director at the Fine Arts Society. Patrick.
Thank you, Joan. That was a wonderful introduction. Hello, Mr. Whistler. It's
Hello.
very good to see you again. My question is about your Nocturnes. They are amongst your most iconic images, and it appears that very few of them are easy to date to a time of year. I'd say that the mood would suggest that they're set in maybe the autumn or the winter, though I imagine that this would present many logistical issues, as well as being very uncomfortable in the cold. So my question is, when did you paint them? And if it was in the bleak Victorian winter, what was your process?
Well, I'm very glad that you are familiar enough with my work to recognize the presence of winter. And thank you for recognizing also the iconic nature of my Nocturnes, something that eluded many of my contemporaries. As for dating them, what should that mean? They were all done, or at least finished, in my studio, whatever the season. The colors were suggested by nature and improved by me. London's atmosphere was ghastly with pollution in the 1870s and 1880s, which would have affected what I saw. But perhaps the fact that they are nocturnes and so must necessarily exhibit diminished light creates what you call the mood. And several, in fact, were done in summer, as the one I mentioned, having created with my mother.
Of course. Thank you very much, Mr. Whistler.
Thanks, Patrick. Mr. Whistler, the next question comes from Michael Biscoe, retired architect and a fellow Whistler Society committee member, in addition to being my husband.
Aha, hello.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good evening.
Can I ask you this? Artists have, down the years, and always have had, interesting relationships, with their models, sometimes intimate, sometimes platonic. Can you comment on your much discussed but seemingly carefully protected relationship with Joanna Heffernan, the main subject of the famous symphonies in white, numbers 1, 2, and 3?
Well, this is an extraordinarily personal question. And I presume you do not expect a West Point gentleman to comment on his relationship with a lady. I will only say that I was very fond of Jo. We were well suited, and we had a wonderful life together. I even admitted to the Pennells that I regarded my fathering of Charlie as an infidelity to her. So the way she agreed to raise the boy as her auntie was quite remarkable. She did have a terrible Irish temper, and that of a redhead besides, always unpredictable. Still, I made her the sole beneficiary in the will I wrote before going to Chile. It was her behavior during my absence. The way she went off to pose for Courbet, it disappointed me. It even wounded me. Our relationship became more complicated after that, never quite as close. And then there was Maud, you see. She was coming of age. Jo was gaining weight. Well, I'll say no more. Oh, only this. Whatever our personal relationship, Jo was a superb model. Inspirational people. Courbet recognized it too. Everyone praised her red hair, but there was something more, something deeper than that, something ethereal about her. Take, for example, my 3 symphonies in white. I took the idea for the first one from a poem by Baudelaire, The Red-Haired Beggar Girl. But Jo was its very embodiment. Admittedly, I borrowed some of the compositional techniques from Rossetti and Millet, but it was Jo's presence that fascinated people. And she's even more haunting in The Little White Girl, which inspired a poem by Swinburne. People went on and on about what it all meant, looking for symbolic significance, but that was just Joe. Oh, I used lots of little tricks and devices. She liked to be called Mrs. Abbott, so I put a wedding band on her finger, but no other model, not Maud, not even Trixie, could have given me that look. The Third Symphony was different. There I was experimenting with a classical style, something I learned from Albert Moore. But those first two, those were due entirely to Joe.
Thank you very much.
And ever the gentleman. Our next question comes from Sandra Higgins. Sandra is one of the founding members of the Whistler Society and an art advisor and curator. Sandra? She is there. I can guarantee it. Well, let's hold that one off until she comes back to us. Is that all right?
That's all right with me.
Okay.
Here I am.
Ah, I knew she was.
With your beautiful red hair again. How could
Yes,
I forget?
I know. I thought I should follow on from the redheads. Yes, of course. Well, it's another personal question, Mr. Whistler. I know all about your painting. Well, not all about it, obviously. I know about your enthusiasm for painting, but I'd like to know what's the most exciting, the most thrilling, and the most enjoyable thing you've ever done. And don't say painting.
Don't say painting. Well, assuming you discount my childhood, which was filled with exciting and even dangerous adventures, I did enjoy the pranks I played at West Point and the excitement of slipping off post to visit Benny Havens' tavern and, of course, the girls we could meet there. I enjoyed my bohemian days in Paris immensely. They may not have qualified as thrilling in the eyes of many people, but my companions and I lived day to day for the sake of art, never knowing when or how we might acquire our next meal, content to live on cheap wine and stale bread, defying bourgeois conventions. We saw this as the only honest way to exist. Henry Murger captured it well in his Scènes de la Vie de Bohème. I enjoyed all my legal squabbles too, especially the ones with Ruskin and William Eden. That latter one, led to a new precedent in French law, the Code of Napoleon, by declaring that a work of art belonged to the artist, not the dilettante who commissioned it. Now, if you want genuine excitement, consider the time I nearly drowned while painting on the French coast. It was early October 1862. I was standing on the beach, studying the crashing waves for painting, what would be blue and silver, the blue wave, when a series of breakers engulfed me. I swallowed gallons of salt water as the sea spun and tossed me in a series of cartwheels that took me out to sea. I called for help, but as I later learned, those silly people on shore thought I was having fun. Oh, but see how the monsieur is amusing himself, they said. You must be awfully strong. Finally, two more reasonable chaps understood my plight, plunged bravely into the surf, and pulled me to safety. And of course, there was my famous expedition to Chile, but you've doubtless heard all about that.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you survived.
Thank you, Sandra. Our next question is from Whistler Society member Catherine Reed. She has a question for you, Mr. Whistler, which indicates she knows something about your efforts to establish your own brand. Catherine, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm interested in your monocle. And I've noticed this evening you started wearing it, and then you've not worn it for a couple of questions, and now you've just popped it back in. So I'm just wondering how important it is to you for your seeing, or whether it could be a style accessory.
Oh, to be honest, which I can be when it suits me, it was both. I am nearsighted, and so I often wear the monocle to compensate when working. But that said, as you pointed out, I did find the monocle a useful affectation in creating my Whistlerian image, as you call it. I played that image to the hilt in William Chase's portrait of me, but the drawing by Mortimer Mempez, foolish boy though he was, better exemplifies my true spirit. I also found a monocle a useful way to maintain center stage when in conversation. People will tell you that I tended to be in constant motion when speaking, especially in a crowd. I would rock and lean and gesture. I would grab chaps by their lapels, all effective techniques in keeping their attention and avoiding interruptions. The monocle served the same purpose. I could wave it in circles. I could screw it in to emphasize a point. Let it drop to the floor as a means of diversion while I fumbled in my waistcoat pocket for a replacement. I generally carried several of them for that very purpose. So there you know one of my tricks, but no harm telling you now. Now, I must admit to following the general fashion of wearing them with a string, as I find acquiring replacements somewhat more difficult in the hereafter. This one I brought with me from the living world. You know, people will say you can't take it with you, but I advise you to try.
I wonder what else you might have brought with you, Mr. Whistler. Our next question is from Victoria Bennett, who is also a Whistler Society committee member and hosts a very popular walk around Whistler's West End in London. She has a very personal question for you. Victoria?
Hi, Mr. Whistler.
Hello.
Lots of the questions have been quite personal, and here is another one. That it's obvious that your one true love was Beatrice, who you married, and then she died of cancer, after which you were bereft. What was it about Beatrice that was so different to all the other models and girlfriends that you had over the years?
Well, how could a man not have loved my Trixie, my Chinky, my Wham, my Luck? I had half a dozen pet names for her. She was beautiful, with those dark liquid eyes and tea rose complexion. She was educated, she was sophisticated, and her laugh was musical. More importantly, she understood and tolerated my whims. She knew when to scold me, when to show patience, and when to inspire. And if I misbehaved in company, which I sometimes may have done, she rolled her eyes expressively and I knew to pause. I admit that she mellowed me a bit, partly because she took life as it came and refused to be bothered by trifles. She was also a fine artist in her own right, and I encouraged her in that, and I made sure her work was exhibited and published. You know, some friends say she chained the butterfly, even clipped my wings, but I was never happy. We shared the same restless and rebellious bohemian spirit, yet she also came from such a large family that I was exposed to a warm domestic life, reminiscent of my early childhood. Someone said we behaved like two children together. There was no hiding my despair when she passed away.
I'm sorry to upset you.
Thank you, Victoria. And thank you for that very sincere answer, Mr. Whistler. Our next question is from Ian Hammerton. He's a professor at the University of Bristol, and his question is personal to him. Ian, can I unmute?
Thank you very much, Joan. Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good evening.
This is by means of almost a family seance. My paternal great-great-grandfather, Holden Hamerton of Hollands, was the first cousin of Philip Gilbert Hamerton. I read with some interest the often vitriolic written exchanges that you shared with Gilbert over nearly 30 years. He died suddenly in 1894, and your response to his demise is not recorded. And I just wondered, were you ever reconciled before his death?
Was I reconciled to Hamilton? Why? Making enemies is a gentle art. And when a work of art is finished, I let it stand. While not wishing to malign the other souls floating around me or to cause distress to their unfortunate descendants, I must point out that as an art critic, Hamerton could say very foolish things. He openly laughed at my first white girl painting and feigned puzzlement at the title of my gorgeous Symphony in White No. 3, by noting that it also contained traces of red, yellow, and green. He disparaged my ability as an etcher by saying I was a strikingly imperfect artist, while at the same time heaping praise on the dismal work of Seymour Hayden and Alphonse Legros. Yet, you see that I have immortalized him by including some of our exchanges in the gentle art. And what greater honor could I bestow on a critic?
Thank you very much. I felt that might be the case, but thank you.
I think you have your answer, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question I get to ask. During our last seance, Peter Weston posed a question, but unfortunately the connection across the ether dissolved before it could be addressed. So I get to ask Peter's question with his permission. He was very fortunate to own one of your etchings entitled Black Lion Wharf, which he purchased from the Fine Arts Society. He wanted to know if it was true, Mr. Whistler, that you were rowed up and down the Thames with an etching plate balanced on your knees, drawing as you observed life on the teeming wharves.
Well, I'm very sorry that he is not here tonight, because I'm always delighted to meet the wise people who paid me the ultimate compliment due an artist, which is to purchase their work. Now, as for its creation, I think he's perhaps a little bit confusing this with the times when the Greaves boys, Walter and Henry, rowed me along Chelsea Reach with my earlier work in Wapping and Rotherhithe. But at no time did I attempt to etch in a rocking boat. I did Black Lion Wharf, which I admit to being one of my favorite etchings, as part of my Thames set in 1859. I resided at a cheap inn in Wapping while prowling the river in search of subjects, but I did not go out on the river. Rather, I hopped from barge to barge when etching. You can judge this by the perspective you can see in those prints. When being rowed by the Greaves after sunset or just before dawn, I made only rough sketches with white chalk on brown paper. That was enough to remind me of the relative position of riverbanks, bridges, and landmarks. I then made my paintings in the studio.
Thank you for that. I'm sure that Peter, when he hears the recording, will appreciate that. Now, our next question is from Stephen Bartley. He's the Whistler Society Honorary Secretary and also the archivist of the Chelsea Arts Club. Stephen?
Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Hello.
As a member of the Chelsea Arts Club, you're considered one of the founders of the club, which is Bohemian in character. Would you say that you are Bohemian by nature, or is this a pose you adopt from time to time, especially when you were first in Paris, for example?
Why do people insist on pinning a label on me, trying to make me one thing or another to the exclusion of all else? Am I American, French, British, a realist, impressionist, a symbolist, a bohemian, or a dandy. I was all those things and much more. I was and remain Whistlerian. That said, I would not want people to think my bohemianism a sham. While I did pose as a dandy when it suited me, my bohemianism was inbred and genuine. Of course, my parents raised me to be a gentleman, which I fancy I remained under all circumstances, whatever outward identity I may have projected at the time. But I was always drawn to the unconventional. I found it very hard to suppress an innate rebelliousness, even for the sake of my dear mother. I suppose my bohemian streak came to fruition at West Point, where my unkempt appearance, lackadaisical behavior, and resistance to authority got me into a good deal of trouble. Once free to the academy, I was finally able to dress as a bohemian during my time working in Washington, which is when I also began to dream of going to study art in Paris. I recall drawing my impression of an artist's studio around 1855, the very personification, I thought, of the bohemian life. And I lived that life as a student in Paris and my early days in London, until I discovered that potential patrons preferred to deal with at least moderately conventional artists. I am proud, though, that I never conformed to bourgeois demands to the same extent as people like Leighton and Millais and Pointer and all that Royal Academy crowd.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next question comes from Nikki Billett, is one of our newest members, and she's also interested in your trips on the River Thames. Nikki, are you there?
Don't be shy now.
She is there. No, well, yes, Nikki, you are there. Are you ready to ask your question? You need to unmute. No, I'm sorry, we're still not hearing you. I can see that you're asking a question, but we're not hearing you. In the interest of time, will you mind if I ask your question for you? Okay. Katie wanted to know more about your night walks to and from Rossetti's seances and your trips on the river, whether they were imbued with spiritual significance. In other words, were your river nocturnes spiritual?
Well, they've apparently had spiritual meaning for other people. And as I said, my interest in communicating beyond the grave led me to see the entire world in somewhat mystical terms. At least one art critic described me as a mystic, in search of that which lies just beyond the borderline of consciousness. But does that give the paintings themselves, be they nocturnes or black portraits, spiritual meaning? Well, that really must depend on you, on the viewer. They were not intended as spiritual statements, even if my vision of dusk and twilight do suggest Nietzsche's mystical qualities. It just so happened that my desire to paint nature as I saw it and not as it was fit the spiritualist's view. Nothing in this world is fixed. All is ephemeral. Now, Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, and other writers used fog and shadow as allegory or metaphor. Did that give their work spiritual significance? Surely the inspiration for painting may be separate from what sees on the canvas, the choice of colors and arrangement of objects in space. Yeah, even my dear friend Theodore Durand maintained that my Nocturnes had reached the very limits of painting, suspending between reality and otherworldliness. I believe his precise words were, Whistler attained to that extreme region where painting, having become vague in taking one more step, would fall into absolute indefiniteness and could no longer say anything to the eyes. And if I've misquoted this in any way, I put it down to my having passed on before he wrote this.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Whistler. And again, Nikki, I'm sorry it didn't work out. Next time. Our next to last question comes from Sheila Foley, who hails from Stoneham, Massachusetts, not too far from here.
Hello, Mr. Whistler. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
Thank you. I'm wondering, what is your greatest regret?
Regrets. Well, certainly nothing that people probably expect me to admit, such as my legal battles and other public contretemps. Those were all necessary to maintain the integrity of my work and preserve my personal honor as a gentleman. I suppose I could get sentimental and say I should have attended Gabriel Rossetti's funeral, though I explained my reasons for that to his brother William. And I see now that I probably should not have blamed my own brother Willie for misdiagnosing Trixie's cancer. But that's life. We do not always react as perhaps we should. As for my work, and that was always the most important thing to me. I suppose I do regret never making it to Madrid to see the paintings of Velázquez. I nearly made it once, with Joe. We even crossed the border into Spain from France. But I then decided to wait until Fontaine Latour could make the pilgrimage with me. Unfortunately, we began to drift apart soon thereafter. I also regret failing to get some paintings just right, to complete them as I wanted to do, as I envisioned. I'm reminded of one of my harmonies, The Little Blue Girl, I called it, the one of Eva Carrington. That one still haunts me.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Mr. Whistler. Now, having waited to ask the first question, I see that Margaret MacDonald has joined us. And so could I ask Margaret to unmute and ask your question? Perhaps not.
I understand that some people may be a bit shy in my presence, but I hope that you can overcome that and address me, as you would address any other master of the arts that you might encounter.
Well, Margaret's question also has been asked, a similar question has been asked in the chat. So perhaps I can summarize that and you can address it. Both John Jones and Margaret wanted you to share with us what you believe seances are. Are they some sort of spiritual contact with the afterlife, or just a fun game after a boozy afternoon?
Well, I may be speaking finally from experience in this matter. I had a few of the fun occasions, the boozy times, as you might call them, at Gabriel Rossetti's home, Tudor House on Cheney Walk. He was the one, after all, who introduced me to spiritualism. I recall it as being quite fashionable at the time. But the fact that I'm speaking to you now proves that something more than wine is required to communicate beyond this veil of tears, as my mother called it. And it wasn't just I who wished to contact the world beyond. Jo often accompanied me, and I believe she had gifts as a genuine medium. Perhaps it was her Irish blood. My brother Willie, too, had a gift for what we called the Scotch second sight. You know, even that old stick-in-the-mud Frederick Leyland attended some sessions. But the early deaths of my father and my three brothers made me painfully aware of the spiritual element in our existence. I had hoped to contact some of the dead painters I most admired to learn something of their secrets. I was disappointed in that request, though I did communicate briefly with a distant cousin. However, this fleeting affair with the afterlife allowed me to see the mystery in this world, and it did affect my painting. People often wonder what people call my black portraits. Well, it was not just the influence of Velázquez that set me on that path. In my Nocturnes, people have often wondered at their creation too, but they also came, at least partly, from what I perceived as the mysterious forces in this world. A few of the less obtuse critics correctly identified their ethereal quality, and none other than yours, Carl Huysman, who was not at all obtuse, called me a mysterious, slightly ghostly painter, fully entitled to the name spiritualist, for the way my Nocturnes carried him by magical means of transport into unfinished times. So you see, while I had no patience for the rituals and rigmarole of religion, I did believe in the hereafter. And now, after all, I am here.
As you are. Thank you so much for that. And that does conclude the questions that have been submitted in advance. We would take some questions from the audience, but having more to do with what Mr. Whistler might think about the world that we currently live in. Asking him to comment on what's different between his life and the life we have at the current day. But I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So if you do have a question, you can either put it in the chat or unmute and ask your question. We have a few more minutes, and I'm hoping that the connection to the other world is going to last, and that we won't lose that too soon.
I hear some flutterings behind me, as though other people want to take over the bridge between my domain and yours, but I can hold them off for a few more minutes.
Hold them
I
off
shall hit written with my wand if necessary.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was wondering, Mr. Whistler. Who's there with you? Are you still having your battles in your spiritual world?
I find that there is no lack of tiresome individuals wherever one finds oneself. Perhaps it is my nature that sees it as such. I have desperately tried to fit in here in what I presume is heaven. I even had them redecorated, as you can see. Nonetheless, I do find myself vexed quite often, but I hold it in for respect of my loved ones who are also here.
Thank you.
We do have another question in the chat, Mr. Whistler, about what you might think of the way art has changed over the years.
I know less about it probably than you do, being in this place here, where the bridge is only occasionally available to me. But I would say on balance that it has improved. And the reason I say that it has improved is because there is no body such as the Royal Academy holding sway and being the arbiter of public opinion, dictating what is not and what is a good picture, as if they ever knew. I see more and more art that comes from the feelings of the painter and that expresses a mood and is not tied to narrative, does not need to tell a story. I think you can think of any number of artists in that category right now. And I think that on whole is to be applauded.
Thank you, Mr. Whistler.
Joan, Catherine wanted to ask another question. Is that okay?
Of course. Of course.
Yeah, I was interested whether you knew Henry James when he visited London, whether he was part of your group.
He was not part of my group, but I certainly know of Henry James, a very fine writer. And I believe some of his works, when we spoke about the ghostly, he was one of the masters of the ghostly. As anyone who's read Turn of the Screw will know. And even though, like most stories, it has the tiresome affliction of having a narrative, there is enough ambiguity in that story to make it very pleasing.
Fabulous, but I fear that
I do. I feel. Oh,
are you still there, Mr.
I
Whistler?
think I'm fading into the void. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I hope that we will speak again. Keep buying Whistlers. It is a sound investment.
Thank you, Mr. Whistler.
Thank you, Whistler.
Oh,
thank you,
sorry that he had to
Whistler.
go like that. Oh, well,
The best
thank all
way.
of you. Right, it's the way it always happens with these seances. Thank you for joining us tonight. Very special thanks to those who submitted questions and asked them during the seance. And a particular thanks to Dan Sutherland for his endless insights. And of course, to Darcy Sullivan for his excellent impersonation of Mr. Whistler.